Committee. Introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Fred Birnbaum with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. We stand in support of this bill, and I think context is important. There's an old saying that, hindsight is 20/20, and I think if we look back at what happened during the COVID era, none of us would believe that how that unfolded was appropriate for the people of Idaho or the U.S. So I think what this legislation really is, it's about being prospective because we do have the benefit of hindsight. And I think the core of the issue is not so much about a debate about the polio vaccine or the efficacy of other vaccines. It is about whether the marriage of expert opinion, science, can be married with the coercive power of the state to impair people's livelihoods. And nobody more than us respects, the rights of businesses. But I think the examples given are not the likely ones. The ones that we saw during COVID were the likely ones. And just recently, President Trump reinstated thousands of military personnel who were discharged for refusing the vaccine. And now I guess they're being reinstated. So yes, there is risk that with legislation that's broad against medical interventions, that you could find some example. But I believe the experience of what happened during COVID is 100x greater than the risk that somehow someone won't get a vaccine or wash their hands or something like that. And for those reasons, I think in the state of Idaho, it is important not to allow the marriage of the coercive power of the state with expert opinion. As they say, an expert is somebody who's 40 miles from home, and we certainly have a lot of experts running around, and we saw very conflicting opinions from them during the COVID era. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll stand for questions.
Senator Burnt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you this morning. Fred, you gave an example of President Trump's reversal in the military, and I applaud President Trump for doing that. The distinction between what President Trump did with the military, which I wholeheartedly agree with, and the private sector are two different things. I know that he hasn't mandated anything regarding the private sector. If I walk me through that.
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Burnt, if you recall, the previous administration, President Biden, actually did mandate that employers with more than 100 people, I believe, require the shot, and then that was thrown out by the Supreme Court. What wasn't thrown out was the CMS requirement. So I think the danger absolutely exists for private employers, but again, the Supreme Court rejected that, and the service members weren't protected, and hence that's why they're now being reinstated. And frankly, losing your livelihood is sort of today's equivalent of going to the gulag, right? We don't send people to the gulag, but most people, if they lose their livelihood, their life is impaired perhaps forever.
Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Birnbaum. I appreciate what you're saying. I'm thinking back on COVID, and I carried all the legislation during those COVID years and trying to get rid of some of those restrictions on people in Idaho. I'm just thinking, and I hear what you're saying about weighing the risks. The testimony I heard this morning was this would take care of some of the mask problems. I know that in the legislature this year, we're going to have a good mask bill. And that mask bill has been very carefully structured, as I understand it, to deal with the private sector and make sure that we don't mess that up, right? And so, I'm looking at this piece of legislation and I'm looking at the definition and I'm thinking of, and I don't know a lot about this, but I'm thinking like Micron and their clean rooms, right? And so I know that what I do understand is you get in those clean rooms, you're going to have to suit up, mask up. And what I heard in testimony today is that when you force somebody into that mask situation, the testimony was that will trigger this piece of legislation. And I know that I've got a mask bill coming later that will carve out some of the oppressive stuff we saw during the coronavirus years. So you see, I'm weighing all this out and I'm looking at this definition, I'm thinking, man, this is really broad. And then I'm going to have these two pieces of legislation hitting each other. And so I'm weighing all this out, and I'm saying maybe we can fine tune this definition just a little bit and still arrive at the place where we need to be on both those pieces of legislation. So I know you're a smart guy, and you know what I'm saying. And so this is what I'm weighing out, and I'm trying to be very, very careful about how we draft statute so that we don't hurt our businesses and that we still protect these liberties. And so I'm just throwing that out for you to comment maybe on.
There was a compliment in there. You're welcome to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Pro Tem Anthony. So, although normally we don't speak about other legislation, I am familiar with the mask bill, and for the record, it does have carve-outs related to respirators and things, and that made sense. I think the thing that this bill goes after, I don't know if I can get to the core of your question in terms of the overlap of this bill with the mask mandate per se, mask mandate prohibition bill, to be clear. But I do think if you look at the core of the issue, this bill was a repurposing of the Coronavirus Stop Act. So I think our framework, is it really relates to that. I guess it's hard for me to see that someone who works in a Micron clean room will claim that the necessity, because they obviously understand what they're doing and it's a very high-tech environment, they would then go to Micron and say, under this, I'm not wearing that. I mean, anything's possible, but I don't think that is really in my opinion, respectfully, Pro Tem, I don't think that's the core of the issue. I think the core of the issue is what happened, and this is why this bill repurposes the Coronavirus Stop Act, that the medical interventions that destroyed people's livelihood was very much tied to, and the mask didn't destroy people's livelihoods. I mean, they might have hurt people's health, but taking a vaccine that they didn't want to, that in hindsight, and now we can be prospective, was damaging to people, and it was even pushed on minors, and we have tons of data that it was absolutely unnecessary. I think that's the core intent of this legislation. I probably didn't address exactly what you were asking. Could this be better drafted? I think it's tight enough, Mr. Chairman and good members of the committee, and I don't worry too much about the overlap with the mask bill.
Okay, thank you for testifying.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Heather Gagliano.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, sorry. Senator Ruckty looks like he has a,
I do have a question for Mr. Birnbaum.
yeah, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Birnbaum. You know, one of the lessons we learn when trying cases is you learn lessons from your last case, but you don't look at your next case as though it's going to be absolutely the same. And I think coaches do the same thing. Learn from the last game, but don't assume that your next game is going to be the same as the last one. And I come back to this idea that we're taking whatever lessons you've drawn and others have drawn from the coronavirus, where hundreds of thousands of people died from the virus in this country, and whatever defects you found in the response to that, and we're going to cement those in legislation restraining our businesses and our schools to protect their employees and our children. Why do you think we should put into statute the lessons you have learned from coronavirus when we don't even know what the next disease that we're going to be facing an outbreak from is going to be?
Mr. Birnbaum.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ruckty, you know, you're asking a speculative question. I mean, we have the history of diseases up until now, and there've been all sorts of variants. And I guess I'm trying to place my thinking about what the next disease would be. I would actually flip this around. The elements of the medical community, and certainly the public health community, and certainly the recently pardoned Dr. Fauci, they have undermined the public trust in our view, and that's not our fault. It's not the fault of the citizenry, and so I think that's brought about this bill because people have this skepticism, and we saw voices that were suppressed, scientific voices, medical voices. So I would say, and this was brought up by the sponsor, in earlier times, this wouldn't be necessary, but we're looking at what happened recently. And that's why we support the legislation. You know, I guess worst case, because you do this, if it didn't work out, you can modify legislation. But I don't see this. I don't see this as presenting the threat to businesses or other entities that perhaps you do.